Yeah, that's ridiculous. All right. Well, we are here now. You good, Josh?
Yeah, I'm good.
Oh, let me just check my, yeah, I'm on the right things.
How you guys been?
Good. Had a few days off, but before that I was quite busy.
You are the reason we're reconvening this meeting, because that was very provocative. And
yeah, I might have been a little excited after getting off service, but
so tell us everything.
Well, let's see where to start. I guess the first starting is starting with like the mechanical ventilation and differentiating the disease from the iatrogenic harms of the disease, or of how we treat the disease. And over our conversations, I think you could hear my frustration with APRV and how I couldn't do it the way I normally do it. And I kind of started to figure out how to do it right, I think, during this 2.5 week spurt, which was essentially the way I think Josh was doing it. And he can correct me if I'm wrong as we go through it. But our ICUs kind of bought into this L and H phenotyping, and what that would amount to is the respiratory therapist was essentially on the windows every day, give you a PEEP scale with your driving pressures next to it. And so you'd have PEEP of 510 all the way up, and you'd have the driving pressures. And so you'd set your optimal PEEP by this driving pressure.
How when they're doing this trial to see PEEP change of driving pressure, how long are they waiting between each PEEP change?
Just a few minutes, not much at all, right? So we can talk about that later. Basically, a meaningless measure. Right. All it tells you is the instantaneous ideal PEEP, right? But the interesting part about it would almost to a patient, the ideal PEEP would always be between 8 and 10, maybe 12, right? But what you would see if you walked around the units, the driving pressure with that ideal PEEP would slowly go up day after day after day. So it would be 12, 10 early, and then it would go to 13, 15, 21. And this lung would just be like shrinking down as you would go on. And these patients were all on low PEEP, low tidal volume, prone, paralyzed, and because of the vent settings require these whopping doses of midazolam. Like 8, 10, 12, 14 milligrams per hour. And because of the course of the disease, you would see them on this for 12 days, something that incredibly long, which I think would just lead to this just collapsing lung that would just harden down to a little ball. And with that, you would see worsening hemodynamics, worsening organ function, that I think was mostly iatrogenic.
How are they knowing they needed these whopping doses of midaz if they were all paralyzed?
So usually from what I mean, unfortunately, this isn't how I would manage them, but usually what would happen is they would get intubated. They're exquisitely hypoxemic. They would require huge amounts of sedation, and usually got hit with a huge amount of midazolam to actually settle them down. And despite these huge amounts of midazolam, they were still having some amount of vent asynchrony, and they would then paralyze.
So the paralysis was a result of the high dose of midazolam. Got it.
Yeah. Now you could argue that, obviously your midazolam overshoots at some point, and you're unaware of when, you're stacking your doses, because you have a paralyzed patient. But for me, this you would see this shrinking lung that came with worsening hypoxemia and VQ mismatching, and as well as this hemodynamic instability, where they would have these increasing pressure doses, and you would have the classic patient that you turn them a little bit and move them, and they become exquisitely hypotensive and their pressures shoot up, and you just have this really hemodynamically unstable patient. And so first, this came around as inheriting a number of these patients and putting them on APRV to re-recruit them. And essentially over a course of a couple of days, you would re-recruit the lung to something reasonably stable, and you would see their pressures just come right off. as you start gaining stability of the lung. No longer when you turn them and move them do they start dropping their blood pressure. And at some point you can flip and turn them without any problem at all. And then at that point, all you really were battling was the basically 14 days of midazolam that, despite you turning off, was leaking out of their adipose. We had like a patient that took like 7 or 8 days to wake up, despite now having a normal lung and passing his CPAP trials. So a lot of this came out of this idea of just trying to not re-recruit lung, but prevent its de-recruitment, because using these kind of instantaneous PEEP titration scales basically just caused us incremental loss of lung volumes. So I would use APRV, and rather than my real strategy of trying to get them to breathe initially, would keep them fairly sedate for the first few days and just kind of suppress their respiratory drive. You wouldn't need paralysis or midazolam. Mostly you just need a whopping dose of the fentanyl and some propofol, and that can be achieved quite easily. And then as you kind of slowly get the lung back to where you felt comfortable with it, then you could actually ask them to breathe again, and it became a lot more successful from that sense.
I guess the first question I would ask is, when we think about what we're doing with these driving pressure trials, it seems to me what we're identifying is the smallest PEEP possible that will retain an average of the whole lung recruitment, right? We're finding the bare minimum PEEP. Because what we're actually doing is we're finding the PEEP at which we're getting the maximal recruitment, and we're calling that optimal PEEP. And anything beyond that, since it's not recruiting anymore, is going to be incrementally adding to the driving pressure.
Right.
Okay, so far?
Or descending. Yeah.
Okay. Now, if we buy into the pressure volume lower inflection point, then essentially what we're doing is we're finding the PEEP that is getting us just above the lower inflection point.
Sure.
Will you all buy that so far?
For that instantaneous moment, yeah.
Exactly.
I think so.
Exactly right. But that doesn't mean, even though it raises the driving pressure, that having a PEEP higher than that is detrimental, because we'd still be on the steep portion of the pressure volume curve, which is essentially what we're doing with APRV, right? So we're identifying the lower inflection with these driving pressure trials. APRV, if we're doing it correctly, is just before the upper inflection point, or some good distance away such that it's safe, but it's playing with the opposite side of the curve. We could enact something very similar simply by using a higher PEEP than that bare minimum, because that would account for the potential de-recruitment later on as the lungs get worse. We could duplicate the strategy you use, Rory, by using a higher PEEP and just accepting the driving pressure maybe a little bit higher, with the only difference being we'd be giving some breaths above as opposed to dropping them down below. But we'd probably get that same lung stability.
Yeah, I mean, I could tell you what Hibashi would say. He would just say that you're using pressure rather than time to control the lung, and that's where you'd go wrong. Now, if you just used a PEEP of 24, then it doesn't matter, right?
Well, no, I don't know if, Hibashi might say that, because he said, he added in recently the idea that the releases are actually beneficial to recruitment, which, gives APRV yet another edge that I never knew about prior. So it makes it, but let's leave that out of the argument for a second. There is an optimal stability point of the lung that could be achieved either with APRV and CPAP. It's the same thing.
Right.
Again, leaving out the new wrinkle that the releases actually help by shaking things up in the ratchet theory. So if we leave that out, then no, a PEEP higher than the lower inflection point would not be attempting to recruit by instantaneous recruitment, like a recruitment maneuver with a PEEP of 40. If your perfect driving pressure was at a PEEP of 8, but you put them on a PEEP of 16, so long ostensibly as that's not over distending any lung units, you're getting that same lung stability you're gaining by APRV.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I would just argue, I think you would still come up against the need for more sedation.
Yeah, I think that's actually what I was going to say. I think you could do the same thing for the lung, but when you wake them up, they'll be happier on APRV.
I buy that completely.
I think, yeah, just a low tidal volume setting just makes it so hard to sedate these patients.
Yep, grant you that. You said at the beginning that your unit was using the L and H phenotypes, but you didn't explain in a way I can understand. So maybe I missed it. What exactly they're doing, and how are they discerning which the L and H is in the unit, and what are they doing differently between those two groups?
So I probably should explain more. They believe that they exist, and they wanted to catch the transition from L to H on the vent, whether or not we could debate whether that's a real thing or not. And so they would use this kind of worsening driving pressure to identify when it became an H-type phenotype. Now, for me, all it really looked like was you were just losing lung volumes day by day, which obviously will turn you into an H phenotype simply by creating a baby lung. But that was really the way they were using it, and then they would shift to the original goal, I think, was to shift to a more traditional ARDS strategy. Though, from what I could see, it was basically used throughout anyway.
I wonder, and now this is making me think, because if we buy into what you're actually discovering with this driving pressure trial, and let's pretend they did it the way I would think it would need to be done, which is like at least 20 minutes between each of the increments, but let's pretend they did it perfectly and you found this number. Shouldn't we be putting a PEEP above that regardless of how they did? Like, if that number's 10, shouldn't the number we put them on be like 14? Shouldn't we not be riding that line? Because when we used to do the open lung strategy, and I know that's fallen out of favor, and we did these trials, whatever optimal number you picked, you'd always go a bit higher, such that you'd have some space for further lung loss.
Yeah, no, I agree. I must admit, I still buy the open lung concept. I think people just fucked it up with these like ridiculous recruitment maneuvers.
Well, I also think the concept that the lung recruits in seconds to minutes is flawed, right? Finding the optimal setting over even 20 minutes is the optimal setting for that moment, rather than, like if you look at it on APRV, when you start someone on your APRV settings, their driving pressure is often 21. And then as you watch them over the day, it drops as they re-recruit lung, right? And it'll go down to, there's times when you have driving pressure of like 4, something like crazy low. But that takes hours to days to do. And if you just use that instantaneous moment, your settings would be all wrong.
So when you were starting them on APRV as ostensibly a rescue from the person before you, which actually puts them in a pejorative light. So let's just say you were transitioning rather than rescuing from whatever mode they were on to your taking over the unit. What would you start them at? Would you just use their plateau as your start?
Sorry, can you just dropped out for a second.
Oh, I'm so sorry. So you're transitioning from the person you took the unit over from, and they were using a conventional lung strategy, and you're putting them on APRV. How you tell us, precisely, because people are going to be listening to this. What settings would you put them on for the initial transition?
So yeah, I would shoot somewhere around their plateau pressure. They're a little higher, a little lower. And the battle I find with these patients is their ventilation. They get whopping dead space, and their VQ matching is terrible. And so their PCO2s are already up in the 60s and 70s. And you're going to lose your minute ventilation when you flip them to APRV to a certain degree. And you're hoping that you recruit in time, that you make up that dead space ventilation. And so I put them on a P high of around their plateau, a P low of 0. A T high I would actually set fairly low initially, because I don't know what's going to happen with their recruitment. So I usually set it around 2, because they already have a PCO2 that's so high. And we can talk a little bit about Hibashi's rescue mode, which I did actually use on quite a few patients in here in that initial period, just to recruit.
Well, that sounds what you're describing.
Yeah, well, it's dropping even but I would typically never go below a T high of 2. Because the thought, or at least the early thought, was you lost the benefits of APRV. But in some of these patients, I would drop down to 1.5 a T high of 1.5, just to manage a maintainable CO2 in the 70s. And then as they recruit, you can start stretching them out. P low of 0, and then a T low of obviously based on their compliance curve. Some of them, it's crazy when their lungs just like come down to a ball. I've never seen T lows this low. I mean, you would have T lows at 0.2, 0.25, 3, like really, really tight lungs that you're getting really small ventilations. And then they would, as they recruit, obviously you dump more and more air.
So what you just described has been emailed to me a bunch since people have been trying APRV on these patients, and a lot of their ventilators that aren't Drager's, they won't go below 0.4 or 0.3 depending on the vent, and they've actually they've had the same situation of not being able to get the release small enough.
Yeah. I mean, so ours will go down to I think 0.2 or I think 0.2, and that was fine for the most part.
What FiO2?
I would just shoot for a SAT of typically 88, but since the donning and doffing and having the nurse or the RT have to go in and out, usually 92, just to give them a little bit of leeway so they're not keeping walking in the room.
But you have two variables to adjust to get the FiO2s. So which one were you adjusting? Because you ostensibly could argue your P high is not high enough if your FiO2 is not where you want. I mean, you kind of have to stick and adjust. You can't adjust. Yeah.
I mean, so I guess I get my P high mostly by...
Cut out for a sec, bud. I wonder whose side that's on.
I couldn't hear it either.
Yep. Okay, so I guess it's you, Rory. No, I think you're muted. Are you? No, you're not muted.
Is that better?
Yeah. You're back.
I just muted and unmuted.
So I have to say, you generally start your P highs because of
so I'll set it around the plateau, and then I look and see what the driving pressure is, and if it's somewhere around where I think it should be for their given compliance, I think I'm in the right place. I usually don't try to use my P high to achieve better oxygen instantaneously, and more think about it as recruitment, and that in of itself should improve my overall shunt physiology, and then obviously fix my PDF ratio that way. I mean, I think that's the art of APRV, is figuring out your P high at all times, right? Like, where do you start it? When do you drop it? And so on and so forth.
Sure. And is there anything else you discovered? Because, I mean, you seemed as if this rotation was revelatory, like you'd finally cracked some of the nut.
I don't want to overstate. I certainly don't want to overstate any of this, especially without any evidence, and get a bunch of angry emails and Twitter.
We'll get that anyway. That's goes without saying.
Well, so much of the difficulty I found with COVID was the multi-organ failure, the hemodynamic compromise, all that kind of stuff that came along with their management. And what I found is it seems so much due to the lungs, and like, I didn't observe any organ failure, use very few pressors when you could stabilize the lung. And as soon as the lung became stable, everything else became easy. And then the question is, like, at what point is the disease gone and all you're seeing is the iatrogenesis of paralysis and letting a lung de-recruit? Because I don't know that exact point, but I didn't really need these 12-day vent runs for a lot of these patients, because, you basically recruit some lung, prevent de-recruitment. On a few days, they're supine and wake and breathing, and then they can be extubated reasonably quickly. So I think at some point, the heavy sedation, paralysis, and midazolam, and not protecting lung volume starts to overtake the actual disease process. And what you're seeing at that point is that kind of residual iatrogenesis that kind of gets augmented because of the length of the disease. In traditional ARDS, what do you have? 3 days, 5 days that you're on these kind of settings, but in this, it's far longer.
Did you have any floridly inflammatory patients?
I mean, they're all inflammatory. Their markers are all through the roof. But I would say we manage most of our patients, at least initially, on high flow nasal cannula and weak proning, and all their CRPs and all their numbers are through the roof, and they have that inflammatory milieu. I never thought that inflammatory milieu was the cause of shock. to me. It just didn't make sense because no matter how long you take them on high flow nasal cannula, they have no signs of shock until you intubate them.
Yep.
And so for me, that multi-organ failure part of things seemed like it was related to something else. Now we have started using steroids and anticoagulation on our patients as well, so that might play a role. I don't know, preventing the kind of other organ failure. But for me, it seemed like all the hemodynamic issues you had was related around vent management and lung volumes.
I will just put this out there because I don't want people to find the exception and call us idiots, but I've treated probably, 1 out of every 20 patients who came in from the get-go hyperinflammatory on multiple pressors and, in florid shock and unable to ventilate. And most of those patients coded within their first 8 hours. So those patients exist. They might be cold prior to ICU admission.
Right. Sure.
What else?
I guess the intubation or the post-intubation. You've probably done a lot of these. Have you found the magic of the post-intubation? How to stop the kind of, you sedate the hell out of them to stop them overbreathing, desaturating, and then they get hypotensive, and then you relieve your sedation, and then you play this kind of cyclical process.
Yeah, I don't want to be prescriptive about any of this because I have no evidence. And I think at this stage, any strategy is fine. But I've been intubating them with sucks to get them breathing immediately. And I have no problem with people that want to use rock. I think that's fine. But my goal is to get them to exactly the state they were in when they were doing seemingly just fine, lying in bed on, either a CPAP or high flow. I'm basically intubating because they've hit some number that's arbitrary at best. So I wanted to get them back as soon as possible. And then they all go on APRV. And if they need to be knocked down because they're taking huge tidal volumes or really, struggling with vent synchrony, then I've been just slipping in between low and relatively moderate doses of ketamine in addition to our standard sedation regimen. And that's gotten most of them through the immediate post-intubation period in a happy manner. I don't know what happens to them when they go upstairs, but, I could have a pretty good time with them for 4 or 5 hours without too much problem.
I think a fairly similar experience. I think we've waited so long to intubate them all at this point. It's, they're all breathing at 40 by the time we intubate them. So that maybe we could leave them breathing at 40 on the vent, but, we feel okay with them breathing at 40 when they're on high flow. But as soon as you can see the number on the vent, it becomes
but APRV breaths at 40 don't faze me as much.
Sure. Yeah.
If you hit their lung volume full, upper point on that curve, it's harder for them to take crazy big breaths. And my friend Chad noticed, you guys know Chad Myers, right? Yeah. So he noticed this, that when you put them on, this new Habashi rescue style where they're getting a lot more releases, it really knocks down on their overexuberant drive, as opposed to what I used to do at the beginning of all this, where I had them on a T-high of like 6 seconds, where they'd seem to really overbreathe a lot more.
Yeah. So I think this was the big thing for me too. This was my frustration. When I initially did it, I would put them at APRV and stretch them to CPAP, within the first little while, and I could not control their breathing.
Absolutely right.
And I changed to basically say, well, I'm just going to breathe for them for the first day. And I would use sucks too, because I wanted to figure this out within the first few minutes of intubation. And then I would hit them pretty heavily with fentanyl and then use these kind of low T highs to overbreathe them. And at that point, I found you needed very little sedation on top of your fentanyl and a little propofol, but you didn't have any of the hemodynamic issues. It wasn't like you were going up on pressors, and you certainly didn't need to paralyze them and give them midazolam at all.
Yeah.
So that was I think the big key for me is to actually use your release volumes where normally I try to stretch as quickly as I can.
Who are you guys going to give remdesivir to?
Thankfully, it's out of my decision. We have like a protocol that ID makes like a televisit, and based on the lab values, decide who gets remdesivir.
This is fascinating to me, though. So I was reading about this morning, and I realized that remdesivir is not FDA approved for any indication. It has this like emergency. No, seriously, it has this like EUA nonsense. Um, but like it's only been published data in like 750 patients. Hypothetically speaking, if remdesivir causes some sort of like horrific complication, could we be liable for that because it's not FDA approved?
Oh, wow. Could we be liable? I think it would be a tough sell when they publish in the major journals. I mean, I think that's a good statement of standard of practice. That doesn't mean it's good doctoring, but I don't think we can be liable.
But I mean, I think most institutes, it's hard for the bedside clinician to prescribe it right now, right? They just don't have enough of it. There's some kind of administrative decision process that decides who gets it. Ironically, I think a lot of times it's to the sickest patients where there seems to be the least benefit, which is kind of funny.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you could argue that Tosi should be given to the ones who are not critically ill yet. You know, all these meds seem to stave off the badness, not treat the badness.
Yeah.
What else? Josh, what insights have you discovered? Is there any COVID cases in Vermont right now? Are they?
He's so angry about it too.
I'm not angry about it. The Vermonters are just too responsible. Everyone is social isolating. We have no cases right now.
Is your hospital empty?
It's like half full, but it's all non-COVID patients.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's how it should be.
Yeah. Our overall cases are down, but our ICU is still full.
I mean, we've gotten rid of all of the, this is at the Imaginary Hospital, of course, all the low-hanging fruit. We've gotten so many of the patients extubated, but there's a cohort that have been on the vent like since the beginning and just will not come off. And they just are making no progress at all.
Their lungs get so small. I've never seen anything like this. They're like, even the ones on normal vent modes, their expiration curves are like these tiny little things. They like turn into these little concrete balls. It's crazy.
These are going to be pulmonary cripples. I don't know what the end game is. I mean, they're all going to get trached and pegged, but then I just don't know.
Right. Is someone going to transplant a COVID lung at some point?
Yeah, that's not a good sell for the transplant services. So it's a big problem. We might have this cadre of poor people who are just screwed.
Right.
Did you guys get to look at the pathophysiology? What do you think?
I don't know. I'm so tired of the trying to figure it out. So, Cameron shared that with me a while back, and I went in and bubble studied everybody in my unit on high flow. Because theoretically, you should see bubbles, right? I mean, you've got a pulmonary shunt.
Yeah, but it's
like a patopulmonary syndrome.
It's like a micro shunt.
Bubbles. I don't know. I think by the time it goes through lung circulation, the bubbles are not going to last. I mean, I guess you could make a better bid for that being a reasonable test if you actually had echo contrast rather than agitated saline. Because I'll tell you why I don't think it's true, Rory, is when I give midline agitated saline to confirm, a midline placement in the arm, I'd say, 1/3 to half the time I can't see bubbles.
In the right side.
We're in.
Yeah.
So I just don't think those are durable enough to make it past the entire pulmonary circulation.
I feel like at the end of the day, like our therapies are going to be kind of similar.
I've lost you guys.
Oh, you can't hear us, dude?
Yeah, now you're back.
Okay.
I got your 10% was a big deal. That was the last thing I heard.
Josh was just saying what I'm thinking, which is, okay, let's pretend it's all real. How would that change my management tomorrow?
Right.
I mean, you're probably going to be enthusiastic about anticoagulation. It does raise the question, I think, of where pulmonary vasodilators, like inhaled pulmonary vasodilators, could fit into the mix here.
So we were pretty enthusiastic about as a group about pulmonary vasodilators early on, and I found that they do absolutely nothing for the majority of the patients. I did have one patient the other day where I was poo-pooing them, and the overnight doc had started them, and on rounds I was just like saying they don't do anything, and then mid rounds they accidentally turned off, and the patient went to hell. But again, once you stabilize the lung, I don't think you need them anymore. They came off relatively quickly once the lung became open and recruited. But yeah, there was that period. And I think that's, again, related to this idea of when you have de-recruited lung, the heart is less happy. And, anything that gives you kind of more dilation of your pulmonary vasculature, you probably have some benefits.
I totally agree. I think it's reasonable to use it as a crutch until the lung recruits, and then, probably don't need it anymore.
All right. Any other thoughts?
I think those were the highlights.
Josh?
Yeah.
All right. Well, this has been a pleasure. It's great talking to you too.
Cool. Well,
come up with any further revelations, share.
Okay, cool. Take care.
Talk to you soon.